Using the stock and flow approach, we've managed to get pretty close to a functional architecture that we know is going to handle most, probably not all, of the major requirements of the system we're trying to investigate. What we want to look at now is what might still be missing from that basic scope that there's some basic heuristic way to go after as we go through. And largely that falls into the area of controls as we move forward. So we saw the example before of picking up cargo in DeLand and cargo in Atlanta and somehow bringing it together, consolidating it, and getting it on some movement over to Hanover in Germany. So that's a basic process that we go through. And what that kind of implies is a visualization of our system, if you will, of things moving around geographically and functionally at the same time. So things we pick up get brought in for consolidation or for carriage. We might move things around among the carriage and consolidate functions, and ultimately we go from the consolidation and carriage functions out to delivery to customers. So it all starts with customer pickups and it ends with customer deliveries on the consignee end. So that's a pretty basic way of looking at the system. It just so happens that if I move forward and do my systems engineering on that basis, I'm going to be in real trouble. This is some very real controls that this oversimplified view ignores. So I can deal with them now just using some basic heuristics of engineering, or I can start developing my system and 6 months from now or a year from now realize I'm on completely the wrong track. So let's start out on the right track and take a look at a couple of the basic controls that apply to this system that probably apply to almost any system you're going to deal with. And the first of those is the control of time, temporal controls. We often depict things happening in systems as though they're flowing to and fro, and that happens a lot in a stock and flow based engineering heuristic, so it's perfectly normal. But the reality is that time does matter. The example we looked at earlier has cargo arriving from two different locations going into a consolidation function. Well, the bottom line is I can't pick stuff up and take it straight to consolidation because I have to wait until both containers are there. There's a synchronization that's required. One of those containers might get to my Jacksonville facility days before the other one does. So they can't just instantly go in and out of these different functions. I could bring hundreds of containers to my carriage yard, but still the vessel's not going to sail until next Thursday. So there's going to be all kinds of delays built into our process that we're going to have to manage. A lot of the time in your systems is spent managing the temporal difference and synchronization of activities that otherwise go unnoticed, and we're just describing the system at a very, very high level. So I have to introduce someplace where I can put the containers in between the stops that I'm looking for. In the containerized cargo business, that's called the yard. So I need to be able to ground the container, take it off the truck that brought it to me, and put it out in the yard someplace. Likewise, when it's time to do something with it, I've got to be able to pick up that container and move it somewhere else. Any of us who have driven down the highway and seen the terminal yards at some of our ports with thousands and thousands of containers in them, we all know what the terminal yard looks like with all those containers. So that yard didn't exist in our thinking up until now because we were just moving things around and kept them moving down the flow. But the reality is things that need to be synchronized need to come to rest. If I'm waiting for 5 containers to arrive before I can do a consolidation, at the very minimum, I'm probably going to end up with 4 of them in the yard until the 5th one arrives. Even the 5th one arriving, my warehouse might not be ready to do the consolidation, so all 5 will get grounded in the yard, and when the warehouse is ready, we'll go get those 5 containers and bring them over to the warehouse. So the yard is an integral component to the management of containerized cargo system, even though in a perfect world things would happen instantly and neither the shipper nor the consignee would care or know if we even had a yard. But for this system to work, we're going to need one in terms of containers coming in and out. So that presumes now we can add 2 functions to our raw function list, the grounding of the container and the ungrounding of the container as we go through. Likewise, I would now depict my system differently in terms of visual flow to say, really, I've got 4 major functions feeding in and out of the yard. I pick things up, put them in the yard, take them out of the yard, deliver them to consignees, take stuff out of the yard to do consolidations, then put it back. So this is really the way the system works. If it just so happens that certain arrivals happen or departures happen at just the right time, maybe some containers will go through the system and not have to touch the yard. But in fact, that's probably never going to happen. And if it does happen, not often enough that I would design my system around it. So really everything hinges on the control of the yard, which is itself a stock. So I go back to my basic process functions that I had earlier. I need to amend this now to represent what's really happening in terms of my overall functions. So I'm going to add the positioning of the container to all these different process steps. And I've got a new overall process for doing that positioning, where I ground the container in my yard. Later I load it on, say, a truck. I move it, I discharge it somewhere else, and then I ground it again. So I'm constantly moving containers around, whether it's within the yard or it's from the yard over to the warehouse for consolidation, or I'm taking it over to the dock to put it on the vessel. I'm constantly repositioning containers as I go through. So both the consolidate and the carriage function have to begin and end with the positioning of the container relative to the yard. So that's a new group of functions going on as I see my way through. So I've basically added the moving of a container as a raw function and the positioning of the container overall as an overall function. So I do my pickup, consolidate, carriage, delivery, and although it's overhead, I still have to do it. I need to position and reposition containers within my facilities. So that's my new exaggerated functional architecture that takes advantage of the fact that I need to temporally synchronize events as they are occurring. So if I go back now to my example, I'm going to see that the basic example that sounded so right when I made it was actually dead wrong. I can't just pick up cargo in Jacksonville because that just doesn't work as I see my way through. The reality is I've got another control I've got to deal with because my system is the facilities, the routes, the vehicles, the containers, but it's on the customer side that I have locations and stocks. So I've got to deal with some physical controls. All the containers are under the line. They're part of my system. And yet I've been thinking about the process as go out to the customer site and pick up a container. But the customer sites don't have containers. It's a physical control. I've got to physically manage where are the containers, where are the vehicles that have to be managed through this process. So if I look at my example again, it can't start with the picking up of cargo in DeLand or in Atlanta because my customers don't have any containers. I have to first deliver an empty container to their location. Likewise, on the other end in Hanover, I don't end my process when I deliver a container to the consignee in Hanover. I end the process when I go back and get the empty container. So what I thought was a simple process, starting with pickup and ending in delivery, is actually the reverse. It starts with the delivery of an empty container and it ends with the pickup of an empty container. That's how I manage the physical control. Containers are part of my system, not my customer's system. So I've got to manage them within my system as I go through. So yes, I've got the yard to manage my temporal controls. And to do that, it's basically the yard is a new stock. So I've had to add to my list the acquire, maintain, and retire my overall system coming through. Likewise, that important line now between my customer side, the locations in the cargo, and my facilities to my container pathway. The containers are part of my system, so I have to account for them at the customer locations. I may design into my system all kinds of operational details to try to minimize what it takes to deliver a container to a location. Maybe if I've delivered some cargo to a consignee, before I return that empty, I might want to look what's the likelihood they're going to want a container delivered to them later today or tomorrow. So I'm going to be able to optimize in my system. But the fact that I'm going to be doing that is only because I've realized that the temporal and the physical controls need to be managed.